So welcome to our last conversation about request to pay. So this time we'll be discussing about the findings of request to pay at the point of sales. To explore a little further this topic, we will have two specialists. Our first panelist is Aude Vicaire. So Aude is the member of executive committee at Market Pay. So Aude, you have 13 years of experience as a consultant in digital transformation, and you have a wide experience in different industries such as transport, banking, luxury, to name just a few. So you joined Market Pay 2 years ago, and now you lead the fintech product-driven strategy. Welcome, Aude.
Thank you. Hi, everybody.
So our second panelist is Jan-Paul van Poel. So Jan-Paul, you are senior payment advisor within ING Bank. So you are in charge, among others, in the relationship within the relevant market infrastructures such as SWIFT, ECB, NCB, to name just a few. And you have a huge experience with regard to global and European transaction banking and global financial markets. You were previously board member of different payment industry bodies, such as EPC, EBA Association Board, SWIFT committees, and today you represent ING in different payment industry bodies, such as SWIFT, EBA Step 2 Business Committee, EBA Request to Pay Task Force, to name just a few. Welcome, Jan-Paul.
Thank you, Jocelyn, and hi, everybody, for this session.
So to walk you through those findings about request to pay at the point of sales, you have Annick Moos, Head of Communication at EBA, and Thomas Egner, Head of Secretary General of EBA. Hand over to you.
Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, super.
Yes.
That's perfect, because my microphone is still crossed out. So I was desperately trying to get to switch the microphone on. So super. Thanks very much, Jocelyn, for your kind introduction, and also for being our moderator for today's session again. Good afternoon to you all, also from my side, but also on behalf of all the EBA colleagues. I must say I was very impressed about the registration numbers, which have exploded for today's session in the past days and past weeks. So it's really a great pleasure to see that so many of you are joining us today for our third request to pay deep dive session. So for the sake of those of you who have not attended our previous sessions, let me just briefly refer to the request to pay survey that we conducted among European corporates in late 2020 and early 2021, since this survey provided the key findings which serve as a basis for today's session. The survey was carried out with the support of PPI and was based on the proposal of an expert group composed of EBA member banks. The objective was really to get insights from European businesses on the request to pay solution, but also features the corporates and the businesses are looking for, but also on the other side, also help or should help us to better understand the pain points the corporates would like to see tackled. But at the same time, we as Euro Banking Association also wanted to start a dialogue between the demand and the supply side of the business and see how to put these expectations into praxis. And this also explains the format we went for in these sessions, to have a representative of the demand side, but also a representative of the supply side. As our previous sessions today, we will again combine these two objectives in a nutshell. First, my colleague Annick Moos and I will share with you our survey insights on the POS POI use case And then we will hand over the floor to Aude and Jan-Paul for their demand and supply side discussions. And I think we're all eager to learn from them about the opportunities and the challenges that they see for this use case. So I have a problem with my PC. Okay, now it works again. But before we dig into POS, POI, so point of sale and point of interaction, let me just remind you that this is the 1 out of 4 use cases that we covered in our request to pay survey. And it's also the last one to be addressed in a series of deep dive sessions. And Annick will explain a bit later why we came to the order of use cases in our presentations. So last year in October, we had a session looking into the e-commerce use case. And in November, we zoomed in on e-invoicing and recurring payments. Both slides, but also the recording from the November session, can be found on our website. And the link will be shared in our chat shortly. And chat is a good keyword. Please also use the chat for any questions you may have regarding our presentation, because we don't want to be this session as a one-way, one-directional addressing you, but it should also help you to understand what the motivations were around request to pay. So use the platform and use the opportunity to ask your questions in the chat. But now let's turn directly to the POS, POI use case. Annick, can you perhaps start off by telling us why we saved this use case now for the last session?
Sure, I'm very happy to do so, Thomas. Let's put this quite frankly. The POS, POI use case actually ended up last in line because there was less enthusiasm about it from the outset. And that's the case both among many corporate respondents, but also among the bank experts who guide our activities on this topic. If we look at the relevance of the use case directly, we had 64 out of 113 respondents replying to this use case. So that was already a bit low by comparison to other use cases. But as you can see on this slide 7, only 64% of them agreed or strongly agreed that request to pay will be relevant at the point of sale or interaction. And this is actually the lowest score that we registered for any use case in this survey. Our most popular use case, e-commerce, for instance, was met by wholeheartedly support from over 80% of the respondents.
Well, that's a clear message, Annick. But I would also say that it's not a really surprising one. Would you agree to that?
Yeah, absolutely. To put it a bit bluntly, I don't think you can expect a match in heaven for a payment situation that seems to come right out of hell. By way of illustration, let's just look at the typical point of sale situation that we can all relate to, I think, and not just those of us who have 3 kids at home, which is the queue at the cash desk of your local supermarket. I think that's really the one that springs to mind immediately when you mention point of sale. This situation is probably the biggest stress test that you could think of for any payment method. So the process has to be super fast, simple, resilient, and you have to deliver a high level of certainty for the payee, because the level of information they have about the customer in this payment situation is often very low. I don't know whether everyone is suffering from the same echo.
Yeah.
So if everyone please mute themselves, that would be really, really great. Thank you very much. Okay, then let's keep going. And there is another big challenge around this use case, and we still have an echo. So if we
Sorry,
describe...
Annick.
Yeah.
The echo, I think, is coming from Thomas Yeah.
Oh,
Yes. Okay.
thanks for pointing that out.
Let me then just try and mute my mic and hope it will.
Yeah, all that testing we did before the call. Sorry about that. Thanks so much. So there's another big challenge around the use case, as you can gather from slide 8, because it comes with a lot of technical complexity, including legacy devices, competing communication channels, and also different processing systems that need to interface with each other. So the key question for Request to Pay is actually how it can best fit in with this existing POS infrastructure, because I guess we don't want to add anything on top. And as you can see from their answers, our corporate respondents actually wanted to keep all options open here. While the initiation of the process via NFC exchange secured the highest score, many also opted for the use of a QR code or existing POS terminals. And there's the extra challenge, that over 80% of the corporates also insisted on real-time reporting to the POS system to ensure that the information about the payment reaches the cashier before the customers run off with their purchased goods. Now you have to unmute again, Thomas. You're still muted. We can still not hear you.
Yes, now it should work, and I'm putting on my headphones in a minute. But coming back to the point, I think that's a lot of requirements to fulfill for Request to Pay. Just the simple items you just have listed, and obviously the list also does not get shorter if we look at the free text input that the respondents provided below. They refer to prerequisites that they felt were missing from our list. And in this list, they called for a uniform end user solution or even an app. Is that something, Annick, which really came up very strongly in that survey?
Yeah, we had quite a few topics that came up additionally. And indeed, in combination, they make for a very complex set of requirements. Data security and protection was very much on the minds of our respondents, as testified in statements below, such as protection against malware. But also, of course, if you move away a bit from the point of sale into point of interaction, and you imagine paying with Request or initiating a payment with Request to Pay in a doctor's office or at your lawyer's, as is the case in some of the use cases, that of course also brings additional data protection concerns and requirements with it.
Super. Can we come back perhaps for a minute on the topic of real-time payment reporting? I've been wondering where this could be solved by way of payment guarantee. I think that was one point which came up, as it's done for other payment methods today. How did our respondents felt about this?
Well, the question of real-time payment and reporting versus a payment guarantee provided by a service provider is certainly very interesting. We raised it in the survey both for POS and e-commerce transactions because it's a relevant question for both use cases. And you can see here on this slide that there is actually a clear preference for an instant payment-based approach at the POS. So only 23% of our respondents would like to go for payment guarantee instead. That was a very interesting result for us as well.
That's interesting, Andy. And do we have an explanation for this preference?
Maybe not an outright explanation, but we do have some hints, and we were able to gather those from the benefits identified for this use case and the reactions of our respondents to these. So if we move on to the next slide, you can see that there's a solid agreement among the respondents for benefits such as cost savings or protection against payment default, or also payment certainty. And if you take all of this together and evaluate that these are highly important, to the respondents, you also have to realize that these benefits can indeed be better reaped through an instant payment than through a payment guarantee.
I think, Annick, looking at this list of benefits, many of our respondents have identified as the strongest advantage perceived for request to pay its potential to reduce the physical cash at the point of sale. So I think that should be a real game changer for the merchants. Is that how would you see that?
Yeah, you can clearly see there at the bottom of the graph that was the response that had the highest score, and this push towards digitalization that Request to Pay can bring is really perceived as its key advantage for the point of sale and point of interaction. We also see this strongly reiterated in the free text answers that we had also given respondents an opportunity to add. They are not in the slide set here, but you can find them in the annex of the slide set, which, by the way, we circulated to everyone who registered for this session. So you should have that in your mailbox. And it mentions additional benefits such as mobile payment method or the move away from checks. So that digitalization focus is clearly the very strong point.
Super. Thanks, Annick. Just before handing over the discussion to our guest speakers and the moderator, to Jan Paul and Jocelyn, we would also like to briefly zoom in two particular benefits raised by our respondents. And one definitely is the fact that Request to Pay also supports a digital data exchange. And this is what Request to Pay at the end of the day is all about, between the payer and the payee. And we've had quite a few respondents who felt that this would really open the door to a new world of opportunities. Anything specific coming from the survey on this item?
Just really that this data exchange opportunity, which is at the core, of course, on Request to Pay, since it is a messaging exchange, indeed raised a lot of enthusiasm among some of the retailers. It turns the payment process into conversation, is how one corporate put it. And of course, that comes with a lot of dematerialization and storage benefits, since we are, after all, talking about a digital conversation. And some retailers still have quite a trail of paperwork that they need to tackle today, especially when they sell higher priced items. This may relate to receipts, product guarantees, return conditions, or delivery notifications that they need to share with the customer. And there was some real eagerness to include some of this data in the Request to Pay flow in order to make their own lives easier, but also, of course, the lives of their customers. And if you have ever spent an hour or so looking for paper receipts in order to return a fancy but unfortunately now broken coffee machine, I'm sure you agree that this indeed comes with a big benefit for retail customers too.
Yes, indeed, Annick, that's certainly a valid point. And if we now move on to our last slide, you can see also that corporate survey participants have not only voiced their needs and pain points for Request to Pay, and some of them even suggested rather concrete solutions. Annick, anything here? And we do see a very detailed graph and very detailed information of one of our respondents.
Yes, indeed. It's a proposal from Heimo Tiefenberg, who's a cash manager with Porsche Corporate Finance, and he told us that his used car dealerships have actually optimized their processes in a way that they can hand over a car to a new owner in pretty much no time. But they do not have a real good digital payment instrument at their disposal on the sales floor today to complete the necessary large value payment transaction that comes with it. And it certainly comes with the transaction if it's a used Porsche, that's for sure. His idea is to use Request to Pay and have the instant payment then hit the dedicated virtual bank account of the sales representative. That you can see it there in the lower hand side there, then on the left, close to the payee SP. So there would be a virtual account hanging there for each sales representative. And as soon as the salesperson sees the push notification of the payment on their mobile that can be triggered from that account, they can then hand over the keys. And I think it's a very interesting solution, which is why we visualized it for the report, because it would also very nicely sidestep the ERP system jungle that you may find at corporate level.
Yes, thank you, Annick. And this may really be a very specific use case, but on the other side, I think it also provides a very nice segue into the topics that we will now discuss with Aude and Jan-Paul. What I like about the Porsche example, and it's not only because I'm a German and a male, so German males always like cars and specifically Porsches. It's really that it shows how heterogeneous the POS and POI use case is, and that some of the payment situations it includes might tremendously benefit from request to pay. And at the beginning of the event, we talked about the supermarket use case, or even other use cases where POS and POI scenarios do apply. With this, I'm very happy to hand over to you, Jocelyn. Also, we are monitoring the chat, but if anyone has an immediate question on the introduction, please don't hesitate, and perhaps we can look in the chat if there's already up for Annick and myself.
Yeah, let me quickly jump in on the question whether the cash reduction preference also applies in low cash use economies, because that's an easy one. We all know, which countries in Europe are prone to already use less cash than others. And actually, we did have a very, very high number of respondents, and you find that information also in the annex, from namely Germany, Italy, and France, where, if it isn't cash, then they sure pay with checks. You still have a bit of a different situation than in the Nordics, where unfortunately our participation numbers were a bit lower. So maybe, if we had had more corporates from these countries, the situation might have turned out a bit different.
Mm-hmm. I think
the scope of the survey, maybe also
exactly.
it was mainly payment professionals and corporate treasurers. We did have some retailers as well. And we did have some banks who replied to the survey. They said on behalf of their customers and aggregating feedback that they had gathered from them. So that's in a nutshell who responded to the survey. And all of that can be found in the report, of course, in great detail.
Yes.
Which we also provide the link for.
Super. And I don't see any further questions. So, Jocelyn, over to you.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you, Annick, for this insightful overview. So, Aude, if you don't mind, I would like to turn to you, and I'd like to have you share with us your expectation with regard request to pay at the point of sales.
Yeah, exactly. So first, I would like to share with you what we consider as request to pay. When we speak about request to pay, we think first of a use case, of course, a use case. Then, since last year, it's also a scheme that standardizes exchange of messages between the merchant and his customers. But it doesn't define very precisely the last piece, which is a payment. So we could have request to pay combined with payment with a credit card. But the value proposition that we see is by combining request to pay with SCT payment. Then we are convinced that it brings very high value, especially at POS, and especially for large amount payment, large amount transactions. And for not only for Porsche, of course, but when we speak about a high value transaction, the first thing is a B2B transaction, of course. But we have also this kind of use cases, even for B2C. And I don't think that the example of when we are, for instance, at Carrefour, on the Saturday afternoon with a lot of crowdy assembly, probably request to pay is not the right solution to pay at the cashier machine. But for travel, when you are buying a nice travel to the after COVID, of course, but to a nice destination, you have a high amount to pay, And in that case, request to pay combined with SCT is really key, and especially with instant NCT. Another use case is high tech. Yesterday, I was at a Samsung showroom looking at the new television, new screen. It's 8,000 euros. So of course, paying by card is very difficult, but then request to pay combined with instant NCT and with the real-time confirmation of payment is very nice to address these pain points. So we see that kind of proximity use cases very interesting, and of course it's still relevant for the other use cases that you have already discussed in the previous sessions. So since request to pay combined with payment is at least it's a new payment solution, so it's key to address first two things. The first one is, of course, to have a very clear value proposition, and a very clear value proposition for both merchant and his customer. And I'm convinced that it's really important to start with. So this kind of combination with payment, it's very interesting for to address the merchant pain points, such as a poor conversion rate. When we are speaking about high value transaction, we still experience a drop of the conversion rate. So with this kind of solution, it's a good way to address this pain point. There is also with SCT some issues to reconcile. The reconciliation is still a pain point for the back office of the merchant. So it's also a way to address these difficulties. And of course, instant confirmation of payment is also very nice when you are at the point of sales. And for the customer themselves, it's a good way to be able to accept or reject a request of transaction. So it's also a nice added value. And another thing to address is the user experience, which is really key for both the merchant but also the final customer to have a very seamless experience, including the whole experience from the start with at the merchant hand, from the request to pay, but also till the end of the payment and the receive the confirmation to receive. But this experience must be handled as a just one global experience, meaning it's not. We need to have not a lot of strong authentication. Otherwise, it will fail because the user experience won't be. This solution won't be adopted by the final customers, and at the end, they will make the success or no of this solution. And once we have a very clear value proposition explaining what it addresses and how it's different and how it's better compared to the existing solutions, and you have a very seamless payment experience, then you can also have needs to work on the an implementation that must be very easy for the merchant and not having to change everything. So using the same protocol and of course not add new work to integrate that. And of course the business model, which is obviously also key. And on that, I want to insist of the payment fees should not be supported by the final customer. Like all other payment solutions, it must be handled by the merchant, not by the final customer, because otherwise it will be difficult to make this solution adopted globally. So these are the key challenges that we see to address this solution. But it's the momentum, and I'm convinced that the momentum is really a right momentum, because we see that all the regulation is very supportive. So the first thing, and it's a good one. Then we see also that the customers are now they are used to pay with QR code. They are used to this new digitalization solution. So it's well, the right momentum to move on and leverage this new habits. And of course, we have already some existing solutions that have proven their success. So there is a real interest, but standardization is key to scale this solution. So to conclude, from a merchant perspective, and what we see and what we have already experienced is that this request to pay combined with SCT Inst is really bring a really high value proposition at the POS, especially for the high amount transaction, and it brings a lot of things, but at the end, the final customer will be the judge. So we're listening to address that globally with the payment part and with a very seamless and strong user experience. And right now, there are still some challenge to overcome, but since the momentum is the right one, we are very convinced that this combination will be the winner.
Thank you very much, Aude, for your detailed view on the topic. So we can see here your statement. Do you want to comment about it, or you think it's fine?
Oh, I think I've already commented, but yeah, there was just the last thing is that it's for B2B and also B2C, B2C commerce, which is not the first thing that we are thinking about when we speak about request to pay.
Thank you, Aude. Jan-Paul, I turn to you. And yes, please, can you share with us your expectations about request to pay at the point of sales? We can see your statement. Can you please comment about it?
Of course, of course. Thank you, Jocelyn. Well, I was requested to give my experience so far and my views from the supply side. And to be honest, I would say the POI and POS didn't come up so much in a priority use case sessions we had either internally within ING or with two international groups where I'm in. One is the request to pay expert group within the EBA association. And the other one is a task force for EBA clearing. And there are 20 plus banks, so we also do have a coverage Europe-wide. POS and POI often was associated with the supermarket example, and then it was no-go area. And that came up quite frequently. The funny thing only is it came up somewhat more when we saw in the countries where people were used to pay with cash or with checks, and due to COVID, were paying out more contactless and having other alternatives. The issue of replacement of cash and checks became more important, and especially in those geographies, and Aniek was already alluding to it, not so much in the Nordics, and I think not so much also in two of ING's home markets in Netherlands and Belgium, but we saw that especially Germany, France, bigger economies as well. So I want to stipulate three things, and which are also in my statement on the screen. Yes, we do think from the supply side that we can deliver something which helps merchants to get rid of their cash and checks, and we do see that importance, obviously. The second thing is, if you want to offer, say, like Aude was explaining the value proposition, especially, for instance, on the high value, which pops up quite often, to be honest, it has to be smoothly, and it has to be quick and easy for the retail customer. And the retail customer had the opportunity also in countries where there was a lot of cash and checks payments, getting more used to NFC, getting more used to QR codes. That's something which is adopted more. Adding up using then that mobile device and the experiences you and me do have that, if that can be built in the proposition on a terminal where the goods have to be paid, not multiple authentication steps. That's what we heard quite frequent. So it has to be smoothly via the QR code and redirecting in environments of the payment service provider or the bank of the payer. And thirdly, easily integrating in the terminal structure of the merchants themselves. Aude had that on her list as well, and we do recognize that one because that frequently hops up, because that's additional investments in additional technologies, in additional protocols. The message from the demand side is very much, please use standard protocols. To our end customers, the existing QR code and NFC technologies. Please do use the schemes in place in Europe, because we also have to look to the pan-European dimension for SCT and for SCT Instant. Well, having said that, from a supply side, you always want to deliver, and our TP, we want to deliver that also on a pan-European level. It helps, of course, that we have an EPC scheme and an EPC rulebook. Version 1 and version 2 comes into June. Additional functionalities have to be built up in order to get somewhat coverage that it will be landing in Europe, having the major functionalities there. The only thing is how to create the reachability. And that's a challenge as such. I ended with that statement, but I think I'll do that later, maybe in the panel session. But there is still a path to go. And I think last but not least, you see somewhat more initiatives locally building up, maybe with the scheme rulebook, to come up with the solutions. But I come to that later. So far from the supply side.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Jan-Paul is pretty clear, and it's very close to what Aude has just shared.
Yeah.
So it seems that you're pretty aligned from the supply and from the demand side.
We learn day by day, to be honest, and that's why we do have these sessions as well. Yeah.
Absolutely. Perhaps so Aude, you have covered a lot of topics regarding the support of high value. Perhaps both of you do want to say something, because this is something that is coming back, and I personally am quite surprised, because I thought that the device will be more a constraint, especially in your case, but I'm seeing that high value is really something, even in your case, being, I will say, a question that can be solved by this combination. Can you just elaborate more on this?
Sorry, elaborate on the combination with.
Yes, the way you see that the first benefit that you have mentioned of having the combination of request to pay is the high value, and that's not a surprise, of course, because I know the outcome of the survey, but I would have expected another answer. And since you both agreed on that, that will be interesting to hear more for people who are listening to us.
Yeah, of course. And I saw also in the chat that there is a question with BNPL, which is also a way to address this high value transaction, of course. So the combination of RTP with BNPL or with SCT Inst, for instance, to address the high value transaction. Why we see it's key? It's because it's a real pain points right now at the POS for the merchants, and there is no perfect way to address it at the moment. I mean, there is the limitation of when you pay with your credit card, so that's threshold of the card, and so you have the BNPL, but there is no other way to pay other by check, but it's very risky, and the process is take a lot of time. So it's not a seamless and a good experience for the customer and for the merchant as well. So this is why we see a real interest with this combination. You took the example of paying at the doctor or at the lawyer, so it's also could be interested, but there are already existing solutions that works. So and of course with the soft POS, in addition to the payment by card, you have already existing solutions. So it can be also an additional use case, but we see for a first step, we see maybe less interest to accelerate, to speed up the adoption than for high payment value, because there is currently a lack of good solution on this specific topic.
Thank you, Aude. Do you see any other added value, and how does it support the existing and new use case? Apart from what we have already mentioned, do you see other areas?
I saw the Porsche case. I saw the Porsche case, and what that sales manager said is, for us as our sales managers have to sell that car, there has to be a certainty and a receipt of the confirmation of the payment to free up the car and to have the sales done. In his mind was also a kind of, say, notification, a push notification to the device of the sales manager, seeing that funds have been received. Classically, in all the cases where we discuss about request to payment, that element, or you name it, payment guarantee, is something which is vital. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but especially with high value payments, there is that certainty element which has to be covered. And the Porsche case opened my eyes, where they could use that notification message then as the certainty that that the payment has been executed. And I think, by the way, they had this kind of virtual account structure where the sales managers are executing this financial transaction. But I thought that was the extra element, and even in combination with means against fraud, because that's where something happens quite often mentioned in use cases. So that's what I've learned and heard.
And in addition, also because still looking at the chat, there is a question about this replacing card at POS. And on this specific question, I don't think that RTP, even combined with other means of payment, can replace totally the card payment, because when you pay, especially with the contactless, it's I think at the moment the simplest and the quickest experience that you can have at the cashier. And my example of Carrefour, the hypermarket, on a Saturday afternoon, it takes time to send a link of payment and to execute the payment, even if it's a card payment afterward. It takes more time than just paying with your card. So I think there are different use cases, and for some, request to pay is very well adapted, especially large amount at POS, large amount transaction at POS. And for some others, the existing means of payments are already working very, very good. So the added value and the value proposition of the request to pay is not easy to understand for both merchants and final customer. So that's why I don't think it will replace the credit card. The cards are still a long life ahead of them.
Thank you. Do you agree, Jan-Paul?
Yeah, I agree with that, because you shouldn't have the ambition to have this R2P having that same proposition as the cards transaction has at that point in time, with the speed and the whole mechanisms about confirmations, etc. That's already in the card world. And you look sometimes, if you want to have that instant payment thing, you have to develop something where that certainty and confirmation element has to come in. And then the question yourself is that of added value? So I agree with Aude that it only is the case where the card is less of the case. With the high values it is. I think other examples which we sometimes hear is say delivery of goods or home delivery, and there's the guy with his POI doing the request to pay and quickly pay that one. That's what hops up. Yeah, I heard sometimes travel as well, and that's what you mentioned, Odd, as well, huh? Which were the sectors and the cases where it hops up. I think the message for POS and POI and R2P is more subtle because there is a whole bunch that can be covered by cards, and only do that in the case where it can be of added value. The only thing what I learned is also some merchants do want to have somewhat more integration of their own, say, sales process and the payments process, and say, I want to have self-terminals. I want to have possibilities where clients do have that click and check out experience. And then I think, for instance, MediaMarkt was one in the survey that gave that example. In the audio world, they were thinking about these use cases which would be of value for them. So that's a category as well.
Okay, pretty clear, pretty clear. Perhaps, Annie, do you want to state some of the questions that have been raised?
Yeah, I think maybe we can turn a bit more heavily to the chat section. And thank you very much, Odd, for already having had a closed eye on that one. So there's also the question that's kind of payment guarantee the other way around. You know, what if the famous buy now and pay later scenario kicks in, which could, you know, in the large value payment space also play a role, I guess. How do you determine or assess the credit risk there? Since for credit cards, the credit limit is already determined, assessed by the issuer. That's maybe a question rather for Jan Paul. Is that something that you have been starting to look at your institution, or maybe in the context of your discussions?
For the buy now, pay later, it's different stuff, huh, to be honest. We only had these discussions, of course, with the other use cases on the e-com side, for instance, which is obviously, and there are constructions which are also which you can embed also in your own credit risk management procedures, but it doesn't hop up with the POS POI, to be honest, because that's quite a different area, and where the risk involved is totally different, of course.
Yeah, if I may add some vision, we see that the BNPL, buy now pay later, at the POS is still very emerging. We begin to see first provider solution for that, but it's still I think the very early stage, and of course it relies on the mechanism of credit card payment, in fact, so for the assessment and for the guarantee with that. But for that and for large amount transaction, of course, what we suggest is to use the SCT Inst, because the merchant has a guarantee that he's paid. He can also give the keys of the car right now at the customers, and there is no possibility, from my point of view right now, to have a kind of BNPL for based on SCT. It's not ready, and if you give the key of the car to the customer and then he doesn't pay, he cancel his payment, well, it's an issue. So that's why the SCT Inst is much more appropriate for this kind of use case.
Yeah, and especially the SCT Inst comes frequently back in the surveys. SCT lesser the case, to be honest. And since we all, as European banks, are going to invest also more in SCT Inst, and given the fact that there is ECB pressing on it, European Commission will be in second half of this year regulation. So for the market uptake, I would say the instant payments rails are getting more solid to solid throughout Europe and also in the local countries, but also pan-European. There will be actually then the say the basis for the backend where Odd was already referring to frequently for that inst solution. It's also the most future-proof one, to be honest.
Yeah, let me just come in quickly again on the large value payment, because of course the solution to combine it with an SET inst that makes it super safe and good for the merchant. But do we need to build in any safeguards on the customer side? Then in addition, we have here a question also about what about claims for fund returns, i.e. chargebacks. I mean, if I just imagine, myself happily in that new Porsche, and and it breaks down after 3 miles, well, I hopefully have a whole guarantee scheme from the merchant. But in terms of the payment process, it doesn't seem to be such an attractive thing for me as a customer to just give away all that money via SET Inst, right?
Yeah, to be honest, I think you would be especially preferring that card option, and you're right. In the whole card schemes, there is the whole chargeback, etc. mechanisms are in there, and that's something where you have to fit in your solution these kind of mechanisms, because that's simply not easily built. That's another thing which I see. If you come into these kind of discussions, people say, okay, then we have to develop something where it will be using solutions in closed user groups to have that specific service available. That's not off the shelf, to be honest. But that's from a supply side view.
So there's no opportunity here maybe for my retail bank to help me through this from a customer point of view.
That's maybe drawing very quickly the solution, but it's more a challenge, to be honest. That's true.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think it's a very valid point to be made.
Yeah.
At least the request to pay helps me in the sense that I have all the information about the payee. Yeah. And that has been vetted. So I think that is a strong advantage that we should also stress here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know, Thomas, whether you've seen any questions that we haven't covered here in the chat. We have, of course, also asked people to vote them up.
Yes, indeed. Indeed, and again, there's a question which, at least to my understanding, does not really have to do have a direct connection to request to pay, but to the buy now, pay later scenario, and that's around credit risk. Right, and the question is really picking up a bit on what you just have said, Jan Paul, for other services around card schemes where you do have a chargeback, there you do have already certain also procedural and operational issues, and also the credit risk is more or less covered by already blocking accounts or blocking amounts on your credit card account. So anything you want to tell to the audience on this buy now, pay later scenario with regard to securing, so to say, and making appropriate credit reservations on the account, because it's much more than just that, right?
Yeah, that's right. and the most, look, there are two things to it. We have these discussions also within EPC for these kind of functionality, how to build that in a scheme for the information elements. But the credit risk thing is something which has to be a connection then of the information flows into the financial admin of the supplier side, of the bank side. And there is the challenge. That's the point.
Yeah. Yeah, that covers also a bit the question which we have received very early timeline-wise about identification of customers, right? Because that's also a big point and a big action item to be looked at between the merchants and the banks to get the identification of the business parties right.
Yeah, but if you use, for instance, this QR code thing, you will be redirected then to the environment of the bank or the payment service provider of the payer, and then the authentication goes into the secure environment, and I think that's key, and therefore that would help also to use that QR methodology and technology, because that's something which is already built, and that would help. And it would also help because they say, I don't want to have that multitude of authentication things. Yeah. That doesn't make life easier, neither for the retail client nor for the merchant that has to, offer a service which is not the real customer journey, to be honest.
Indeed, so identification really takes place at the place of the account holding bank. The merchant has nothing to do with it. I think that's also a nice feature of request to pay.
Yeah, absolutely.
And from a merchant perspective, it's very important to have this packaged. So it has to be the easiest possible for the merchant to integrate, and he does not have to make additional development. So it has really to be standardized, to be packaged, and so a bit of the shelf with all the required information to be able to identify the payer.
Yeah. And I think that the authentication thing is, of course, key in this whole service, and therefore I think, Odd, you're fully right. Therefore, we are also the sponsor of using that existing technologies going into the safe environment of the bank, because, and knock on wood, of course, but that's the most secure way, and that helps. So we can help the merchant that there will be no additional stuff. That's so key.
Adoption, I think adoption is key, and to ease adoption, it must be very, very easy for the merchant to integrate and to use. And also, I say it again because it's very important to avoid too much authentication. Just one for the whole experience is enough. A strong authentication, no problem. It's very important, especially for large payments, but we must be careful and not multiply the number of authentication during the customer experience. It's also a key point for the adoption.
And a great closing point.
We didn't exercise that one. Of course not.
Jocelyne, any last words?
Yes, thank you very much to Aude and to Jan-Paul for your insight. And if I have to have some takeaways, there are a few things that I will highlight. Is you both agree on the added value brought by request to pay at the point of sale. So there is the high value, of course, the user experience. And I really like what you emphasize on the fact that there is no struggle. It's an additional service, and it has its use cases, dedicated ones. Thank you very much for your insight.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the audience.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you for the questions. Have a nice day.
Okay.
Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Have a nice day.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.